Okay, good morning to everyone, and thank you for joining us in the 8th edition of the Global Pensions Program. This is the last day of a very busy week. It's a pleasure to having you with us today. Buenos días y gracias por sumarse a la 8ª edición del Global Pensions Program el día de hoy. Es un placer tenerles aquí. Before we start, I would like you to go over a few technical issues. Since the presentations will be in English or Spanish, for participants who wish to hear their interpretation, you will find an icon at the bottom of your screen that says interpretation. If you click on this icon, you will have the option to choose your language. I will repeat this in Spanish now. Los presentadores hablarán en inglés o español. Para quienes desean escuchar la interpretación, verán un icono en la parte inferior de sus pantallas que lee interpretación. Basta oprimir el icono y seleccionar el idioma. During the presentations this morning, your cameras and microphones will be off. You can send your questions to Q&A. Since we might receive many questions, we apologize in advance for not being able to respond to all of them. We will include as many questions as time allows. My name is Mariano Bosch, and I will be moderating this session. Before we move forward, however, we would like to know a little bit more about you, who is in the room. A question will pop up now on your screen and ask you about the role that each of you are playing in your country. Please take a minute to answer this questionnaire. It's important for us to know the audience of this course and who are we reaching, so we're looking forward to your answers. Thank you very much. So if you can take a minute now to answer the questions. Okay, so thank you so much for answering the questions. It's as I said before, it's a pleasure having you here. It is my pleasure now to introduce somebody who doesn't need an introduction in this arena. We have with us Olivia Mitchell. She is, as you all know, a reference in anything that has to do with pensions. We have all followed her for many years and read her papers and her guidance on these issues. Olivia is the International Foundation of Employee Benefit Plans Professor of Insurance Risk Management and Business Economic Policy, Executive Director of the Pension Research Council and Director of the Water Center on Pensions and Retirement Research, all at the Warren School of University of Pennsylvania. Concurrently, Dr. Mitchell serves as a research associate at the NBER. She's independent director of the Wells Fargo Fund Board's co-investigation for the Health and Retirement Study at the University of Michigan, a member of the executive board of the Michigan Retirement Research Center, among many other positions. Olivia has researched extensively on these issues, and today she's going to talk about something that is extremely relevant for the current context, which is how pensions and pension systems in general will have to adapt to the new reality that we are all facing, which is the pandemic and COVID-19. So as I said before, Olivia, it's a pleasure having you here. It's really an honor. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, and the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mariano, and thank you also to Cristina Nakasone and Paulina Granados, who've done such a great job setting this up. And what a wonderful week it's been. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I will, with your permission, share my screen. and talk a little bit about how to rebuild retirement systems post-COVID. Now, I'm assuming there will be a post-COVID period. It seems like every day the news gets more complicated. But here we are, and let me straighten this out with your permission. And I plan on talking maybe 35 minutes, and then I want to encourage a lot of discussion during the Q&A. And also, if I speak too quickly, I hope the translators will send me a chat or something like that so that I can make sure that I see it. Okay. So without further ado, let me proceed. Now, every retirement system in every country is somewhat different for obvious reasons, because of history, because of culture, different financial systems, but there are some common themes. So in the Americas, we tend to talk about a three-legged stool, a three-legged chair, and each of the legs of the retirement system is very, very important. So typically there will be a public social security system. Frequently it's pay as you go. That is, you tax workers today and you pay retirees today. So it's not typically a funded system. These public social security schemes try to balance the needs of insurance versus welfare. So the insurance component is that which provides more benefits to people that pay in more. And the welfare element is redistributive. It provides relatively more benefits to people who have low income and need it more. And the second pillar of the three-legged stool is the employer-sponsored pensions component. These can be defined benefit, defined contribution. If you wish, during the Q&A, we can talk about hybrid plans, which are a mixture of the two. And then last, we have private savings. Many older people own their homes, and it's possible in many countries to access the equity in their homes to help finance retirement. And then, of course, there's financial assets, stocks, bonds, bank accounts, et cetera, that people rely on in later life. Now, I know this is a very pension literate audience, but just to get on the same playing field, defined benefit plans are traditionally plans where they tell you the formula for the benefit you will receive. So for example, the benefit might be equal to 2% of your final pay times your years of service. So if you've been there 30 years, 2% times 30 is 60, you get 60% of your final pay as an annuity, typically paid as a monthly income the rest of your life. This is very common in most European national systems, many Latin American and the US system as well. They were very popular in the US for corporate pensions, but for reasons we'll discuss, their popularity has declined dramatically. Then you also have defined contribution systems, and these have been the programs that have been growing most quickly around the world. And here, instead of telling you what the benefit is, what's specified is the contribution amount. So it might be 6% of your current pay, or 10%, as in Chile. In Australia, they're around 9%, trying to move up to 12% contribution rate. But what's stipulated is the contribution, and then the money gets invested and you get what you get when you hit retirement age. And then, as I said, there are cash balance plans or hybrids that combine both elements. Now, it's important to think about why we should fund a pension promise. And there's good reasons, there's positives, and there's negatives. So many people, myself included, believe that a funded pension can help reduce uncertainty about future contributions and possibly future benefits. So if you don't fund a pension plan and the tax revenues are insufficient to hit the retirement objectives, people will be living in poverty in old age. It's also the case if you fund your pension plan, you can diversify the portfolio. You're not completely reliant on one employer or even one government to stay afloat and pay the benefits. If you diversify your portfolio around the world, then you at least have some cross-sectional diversification. It's also true that a funded pension plan, and probably more true for defined contribution than defined benefit, can allow portability. That is, a worker associated with a given firm or a worker employed in a given country, if the plan is funded, that worker may be able to move around different firms and different countries even to be able to keep the pension and retain it until retirement age. And also in many Latin American countries, there's, I think, a great agreement that establishing a funded pension system, like in Chile and Mexico and Peru and so forth, Colombia, that this can possibly deepen capital markets and provide a means to increase economic growth. So those are all positives. On the negative side, when you move to a funded plan and away from an unfunded plan, the difficulty is that if you were in an unfunded plan, the retirees today have no money set aside for their own retirement. They're relying on the workers. So if you move to a funded plan, some group has to pay twice. That is, they have to pay for their own saving, for their own future, and they need to support the retirees who didn't save for their own future. So that's what we call transition costs, and they can be fairly substantial. And different countries have different approaches to that problem. Administrative costs may be higher. Some people allege that they are, but maybe not. We can take that up in Q&A if you wish. In my experience, government-run plans that are not funded tend not to put all the full costs of the system on the books and don't report the full costs. But it is true, of course, if you have a funded system, you need to govern it, you need to regulate it, you need to supervise it. All those are costly and demand attention. So I have two pictures that I would like to show you that just illustrate very cleanly what the difference is between an unfunded system and a funded system. So this is a pay-as-you-go or unfunded system, and it's a picture of plumbing, of pipes. So the money comes into the system and it's immediately paid out to the pensioners. And so this is a very simple graph, as you can see. A funded system is a little bit more complicated. Here you have money coming in from the employer. Here you have money coming in from the employee. And on top of that, you have investment earnings that go into the tank of the pension fund. And when people reach retirement age, the benefits are paid out to the pensioners, partly as a function of the contributions and partly reflecting the investment earnings that were made. There is one small faucet down in the lower left. And that faucet could be small or large, depending on how big the fees and expenses and commissions are. So that's something that we have to pay close attention to in a funded plan. Now, everyone has a different experience with different types of funding. Here on the left, on the vertical axis, I have an indication of whether the plan is funded, no versus yes. And on the horizontal axis, I indicate whether this plan or this country has a plan that is an individual account system, no or yes. So many of the big old countries, the US, Europe, and in the case of Germany, corporate plans as well, they are not funded. And they are not individual accounts. That is, the government or the corporation makes a promise that the benefits will be paid, but does not set aside any money individually focused to make sure the benefits can be paid. Now, in the bottom right-hand corner, we have accounts, which many of you are familiar with in the Latin American region. So individual accounts are started in Chile and then became very popular across the rest of Latin America, also Australia and Sweden. They have funded accounts and they're also individual accounts. So those are the two counterparts. We also have funds in the bottom left-hand box, which are funded. There are assets behind these, but they are not managed as individual accounts. And these types of funds tend to be very popular in countries of the former British Empire, like Singapore, Malaysia, and also some US corporate and public defined benefit plans, where they're not well funded or sometimes not funded at all, and they're not, or they are funded, sorry, but not fully funded sometimes, and they're not individual accounts. And lest you think that the top right-hand corner is empty, it's not. Here you have plans which are individual accounts. You contribute and you get an entry in your individual account roster, but they're not funded. They're notional accounts. And these are available in Latvia, Sweden, and several other countries. So when we think about the different pension options, we need to keep in mind which ones we're talking about and which are funded versus not. Now, full funding is a complicated notion. In principle, it's simple, however, which says a plan is funded if the assets equal the liabilities. So far, so good. In the case of the defined contribution plans on the left, full funding simply requires that the assets equal the current account's balance. In other words, the money I have contributed into my defined contribution plan is the money that's owed to me. So it's a fairly simple accounting framework. Not so in defined benefit plans. Their assets are supposed to be equal to the expected present value of promised future benefits. And as anybody know that's worked with defined benefit plans, this is a matter sometimes of science, but frequently of art. And reporting and accounting rules play a major role. Now, pre-COVID, the world's retirement systems were not healthy. Many Social Security systems were confronting insolvency, partly because they're run as pay-as-you-go schemes. The workforce had not grown. In fact, in some countries, low fertility means that the workforces are actually shrinking. And so the tax base to collect contributions to pay Social Security benefits were shrinking. Many private and public defined benefit plans were underfunded. And very importantly, and often not remarked, is that since the global financial crisis of about 10 years ago, we've been in a world of very persistent low returns. And these have hurt defined contribution plans. Obviously, I should have also added defined benefit plans, because if the investments aren't paying much, we're in trouble. And countries around the world were facing increasing debt and also declines in saving. The graphic on the right is from the World Economic Forum, which back in 2015 already claimed that the underfunded pensions were a global time bomb. So the gap by 2050 is the dark bar, and this is 119 trillion just for China. You see India on the list, the UK and the US as well. And this is just a partial tally of the underfunded time bomb that was faced pre-COVID. The retirement savings gaps were also substantial. Here, the black bars indicate how many years of assets retirees have to live on. And the blue bars reflect the life expectancy at retirement. So in the US, typical retirees had about 8 years worth of money to live on, but they were likely to live another 11 years. And you see across the board, Japan especially, having a fairly large deficit. So this was a very important problem already before COVID. Some of you are familiar with the Melbourne-Mercer Pension Sustainability Index. This was actually collected pre-COVID, And what they do is based on several different criteria. They rank or they give a grade to countries' pension systems. And the ones at the top of the list in green got an A, a top mark. Good benefits, sustainable, good integrity, robust. This was Netherlands and Denmark. Australia was deemed pretty good, sound, but some areas for improvement. As you go down the list, interestingly for this audience, Chile was getting a B. And given what we've seen in Chile and the pension protests for the last year, 2 years, this is surprising to me. The US was deemed only worth a C+, and then a number of Latin American countries show up in the C range, Peru, Colombia, Brazil, etc. So some good features, but not very sustainable. And then the major weaknesses are listed at the bottom, and you can see that Mexico among the Latin countries is there. So this again was pre-COVID. Now, I'm not going to spend much time talking about health and healthcare costs, but we have to remember that when we're thinking about retirement preparedness and retirement well-being, that healthcare and healthcare costs are a critical issue. And you see that over 73% of the world's population was deemed pre-COVID to live in countries that scored below the 50 percentile. Quite ironically to me, the US was right up here at 85%, and yet we have some of the highest COVID deaths in the world. So keep that in mind. So what does the future look like? It's anybody's guess, but especially with this second round, or some people call it the third round of COVID pandemic illnesses and deaths, the projected changes in the GDP are negative across the board. So Brazil, 7.4% drop if there's only one big hit, but as we know now, a second big hit is in the offing. And again, negative growth rates in Mexico, US, OECD, across the board. So we're not out of the woods yet, for sure. And the low interest rates are forecasted to continue. And this is from the Congressional Budget Office. This is the 10-year, the dark line is the 10-year US Treasury yield going below zero, and the Fed funds rate sustaining itself below zero, forecasted for the next decade. And this is also going to make it very difficult for people who do save to make their investments grow for retirement. In fact, this picture estimates or shows the results of how much you would have to save to provide yourself $1 per year of retirement payouts for 25 years after retirement. It's just a handy way to try to say, how expensive is it to buy yourself a $1 per year annuity for the rest of your life for 25 years? So as of December 2019, to buy yourself $1 of retirement income for 25 years only cost about $10. And as of March 2020, about the same. But as you look ahead, what you see is that compared to a year ago, it's gotten more and more expensive to provide yourself 1 year of retirement payouts. So this is obviously a key concern for all of us thinking and hoping that we will live to retirement and through retirement. Now, of course, there's been a rapid rollout of social protection programs, social insurance programs. The darker countries are the countries that have a maximal response according to the ILO, and the lighter countries have had less of a response. But the types of programs that have been rolled out are not all the same. So what you see in this graph is that the types of programs rolled out tend to emphasize job protection, income protection, health, clearly, that's obviously a need, but pension support is very far down the list. And so people have not yet started to worry about fixing pension systems. Now, a lot of the response will depend on how the labor market responds, because as I'm fond of saying, pensions are a reflection of the underlying labor market. And here you see again, pre-COVID, that self-employment or gig employment had already become a reality in some countries. And I don't have the listings in Latin America, I regret. But you'd see France and the UK had already moved toward a more flexible self-employment arrangement. And this makes it more possible for the labor market to recover. The US, Japan, Italy, and Germany were not nearly so flexible pre-COVID. The other question is how many of us will be able to continue working from home? In some occupations, it's very possible. And so other occupations, it's been deemed not very possible. And of course, this will vary by country and depend on the infrastructure that's available for working from home. Another problem people have not, I think, focused on enough is that labor markets can't recover until there's a safe way to travel to and from work. But many cities, and I live in the top bar area, New York, Jersey, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, where at least half the people going to work every day prior to COVID were going on subway or trains, and the rest were going on other public transportation like buses. The more public transportation is a method of getting to work, the longer I think it will take for the labor market to recover. Now, another issue is that many countries have very few benefits to help in situations such as the ones that we're in. So the US is red all the way down the line on the far right, and the darker the green, the better is the program. So Denmark has a fairly robust unemployment benefit system, robust maternity and paternity, robust annual leaves, and sick pay. So that's the type of social protection that really does help in times such as this. The US, unfortunately, is not in a good position. Now, back to the point of low returns, just briefly. Let's imagine that we wanted to try to save enough so that when we retired, we could hit a 50% replacement rate. Now, by replacement rate, what I mean is that the benefit you could buy with the amount of income you saved would be sufficient to equal half of your pre-retirement income. The argument then being that the other half would be provided by a social security system. And so I have two panels. I'll show you the first one initially. Let's say that the rate of return you could earn, real rate of return you could earn on your money was 3%. And you started 40 years before retirement. So if you were 25 years old and you intended to retire at 65, how much on average would you have to save of your income? And the answer is about 11% of your pay. If you waited until 20 years before retirement, you would have to save over a quarter of your pay. So obviously the message here is start early because it's easier. However, what if the real rate of return were only 1%? And what if you started saving right away at age 25, you'd still have to save close to a quarter of your income. And heaven forbid you wait till you're age 45, because then you're having to save half your income. It's just really going to be tough to do that. Of course, some people have said to me, well, the result of COVID is that the old people are going to die and there won't be a retirement problem anymore. And that's, I think, not true. It's true that a lot of the COVID deaths have been in people over the age of 65. But the centenarian population, the population of people over age 100, is projected to continue growing. So what can we do? I think that it has to be the case that retirement ages must rise, and they must rise quite a bit. So here's a listing of different countries. The blue bar is the effective rate, that is the retirement age that would be expected or feasible under these systems. But the diamond refers to when people typically retire. And as you see here, with only two exceptions for men, Korea and Mexico, And one exception for women, most people are retiring substantially younger than age 70. And in my view, it's going to be necessary for people to work even beyond that age, perhaps to 75 or 80, given the low returns and the problems the pension systems face. And then you can see in the EU and the OECD, again, very low retirement ages. Now, sometimes people say to me, well, older folks can't work. It's just impossible to expect that they would be able to. But yet some recent research from the NBER has measured what we call the work capacity. How many years of work from ages 55 to 69 would, in this case it's men, would men be able to do if they worked as much as men facing the same mortality risk back in the 1970s? And the estimates are that in the UK, on average, men could work 8 years longer, France as well, somewhat lower in some of the other countries, but there's a lot of unused work capacity out there. And in the face of declining fertility and shrinking workforces, it seems self-evident to me that people will need to continue to work. Obviously, the pandemic is having a very disproportionately harsh effect in poor countries. And this is from a World Bank study suggesting that the crisis could push tens of millions of people back into poverty, depending on how bad the economic contraction continues to be. So that's a very dire prediction. The IMF emphasizes the heterogeneity of the population. Not everybody's going to be affected equally. Specifically, people who are not college educated are going to be the most vulnerable. And so that could really influence where the pockets of poverty arise. Moreover, young people are coming out into this labor market, if what there is of it, in a very bad time. Many of them will be unemployed for a very long time and not be able to start their retirement saving. This was ironically also the case back during the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, terrible job market. That whole group of young people also faced a very bad employment situation. So let me stop with a few questions for you. First of all, I think the big political issue and the economic question is who should manage the risks facing the elderly? 100 years ago, the elderly lived with their children, their grandchildren. If mom and dad couldn't manage the farm anymore, they would feed the chickens or take care of the children or do something productive in the family household. Over time, that's changed, and we have turned in the past to employers and the government to try to help take care of us in old age. But many employers and governments either don't want to take that risk or can't afford it. Continuing problem and question is, should we try to continue funding the retirement systems or revert to a pay-as-you-go? I believe that in a world with declining fertility, pay-as-you-go is unviable, but we can discuss that. And then I only just touched on pensions versus healthcare, because I think we have to decide how much of our national budgets and our personal incomes we can afford to devote to one versus the other. Ultimately, the intergenerational challenge is to decide how much of GDP should go to the elderly and who should pay for it. And of course, how do we get to political consensus on this topic? So to better manage retirement risk, I think we have to reinvent retirement. And it's going to have to be, the retirement age is going to have to be extended much longer. To do that, we're going to have to invest more in skills and human capital, for sure, and not decide that, well, once I finished my secondary education or college, I'm done. I never have to learn anything anymore. Wrong. You have to keep educating yourself throughout the lifetime. And part of that education should be in financial literacy. Too many people around the world are unable to answer simple economics questions. No wonder they don't save. They don't understand compound interest. No wonder they don't invest wisely. They don't understand diversification. So these are critical. Ensuring against longevity is very important. I've done some work on annuities, retirement income streams, and how to put those back into the defined contribution pot. Making home equity is increasingly important to the extent that older people probably have a home and they probably have some asset value, some equity in that home, and they may need to tap it in later life. And we clearly need to restructure pensions. So without further ado, I did want to stop and just briefly mention the International Pension Research Association. This is a new group that we've just formed in concert with the OECD and especially with the help of Pablo Antolin. Thank you, Pablo. It's a new group seeking to improve the quality and impact of research on pensions and to be the global voice of research in the fields of pensions, aging, and retirement. So I encourage you to go to this website, iprassn.org, and take a look. We've put up some webinars so far, and we hope to do more in the future. So with that, let me stop. And I appreciate your attention, and I'm looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia, for such a great presentation and so clear on the topic, so where we were coming from in terms of pre-COVID situation of pension systems in the world and the challenges ahead. No, what are the new pressure points that we face in with the current crisis and with something that we already knew, no, with the aging process in many countries. Let me gather some of the questions that have been coming through the Q&A, and then I have some questions myself, so I'll take advantage. So let me start with something that we have been working on here at the IDB as well and in many other places. This new flexibility of the labor market that is coming through platform work, on-demand work, gig economy, however we want to say. So the question goes like this: so is flexibility of the labor market through employment with no or few social protections a good thing? And always the colleague says, I don't think it is. Sure, who will be proven right, UK or Germany? I mean, how do you see that as a factor in addressing the pension systems in the future? How we treat that part of the economy?
So I think that the existence of social protection should be separated from labor market flexibility. In other words, in the past, in many countries, pensions, healthcare, disability protection, et cetera, were offered through the employment system. That is, your employer, your firm provided a mechanism for pension saving, healthcare, and so on. To me, the advent of COVID has exposed some of the deep problems with such an arrangement. With so many millions of people unemployed, at least in the US, they can't get health care anymore because their health care was tied to their employment. And that seems to me to be a particularly dangerous and risky healthcare system. It's also the case that flexible employment, gig employment, whatever we're calling it, is in fact a very attractive arrangement for older workers. So many older workers were driving Uber and Lyft, and many older people were setting up Airbnb arrangements pre-COVID. Why? Because this was a way for them to work a bit on their own schedules, on their own time, and was a very attractive situation for them. But again, what it says to me is that flexible employment, gig employment is potentially a very positive development, but we have to still keep in mind that there need to be other systems that provide the social protection. So for example, I'll take my own occupation in the research and university teaching area. We're not all tied into a pension plan for our job exclusively. That is, I pay into a pension system, which is a multiple employer system covering the whole country. So as long as I work in any kind of a an employer in this field, I have a portable pension. It's mine no matter where I go. I think that's the model that we should be increasingly looking at. And if I could add one other thing, in the EU, the European Union has recently adopted something called the PEP, Pan-European Pension Program, PEPP. And the idea here is that capital is mobile across Europe, but labor has been held in place by tax rules and benefit rules and social insurance rules. So the notion is that now with PEP, you can contribute to this international pension system that's supervised and regulated, and you can take your benefit from that international scheme in whatever country you live in. There is one wrinkle, one problem, however, and the problem is that typically governments let people set aside money into their pensions on a pre-tax basis. And so what this means is that if you are in Germany and you contribute to your PEP on a pre-tax basis, and then you decide to go retire in Spain or Portugal, then the taxes that will be collected will go to Spain or Portugal, not to Germany. And so I think we have to revisit the whole taxation of pensions in order to solve that problem.
Thanks, Olivia. I think you touch on very important points. Some of them that we have been talking a lot here at the IDB for a long time, what is just this separation between, how you provide basic benefits in general to citizens. Healthcare is one example, how we delink that from the employment conditions. Santiago Levy has done a lot of work on that.
Right.
Let me just follow up a little bit on that question because at the end of the day, should countries mandate, let's say, contribution for this gig economy? I mean, we talk about the separation between, maybe not the health part, but should they still have a clear mandate to save for the pensions and contribute for their disability insurance, etc., or we should allow that economy just to evolve into a voluntary systems? I think that's a key question in the current situation. No?
Well, I think most countries do mandate some sort of contribution to a pension system. The problem is in much of Latin America and also in Asia that there's a lot of informal labor markets and very low coverage levels. So even if the mandate stipulates that everybody should pay 10% into the pension, like in Chile, only about half of the people really do contribute because they work off the books. Or for a long time in Chile, self-employed workers were allowed to opt out of the program. Michelle Bachelet, when she was president, stipulated that the self-employed workers needed to be included in this system. But there's always room for working off the books and so forth. This is why some countries try to pair the health contribution, the health tax system, and the pension system, so that if you contribute, some of it goes to your pension, some of it goes to your health, but at least you get an immediate reward, which is healthcare, health insurance. There may be other ways to try to use behavioral finance to give people an incentive to save through the system. But it's also going to take a lot more education on the part of the government. I did a survey in Chile probably 5 years ago, and I asked people what their perception was of the pension system. And I will tell you, an enormous number of people had no idea how the system worked. Many of them thought that it was a defined benefit system, even after 30 years of it being a defined contribution system. And people had, as we know now, very unrealistic expectations of what they were going to get from the system. So I think we have to lay part of that obligation on the government steps and say, you must educate people about the system that they're participating in. I think had that been the case, many countries would have been more reluctant to allow people to take out money from their pension accounts during the COVID.
Thanks, Olivia. Let me ask a couple of, let me put together two questions that are coming in. On the one hand, people are asking, it looks like we're in a point where we will require people to work longer if we want to have decent pensions in the future. But at the same time, if we look at Latin American labor markets, formal work really starts declining very early, in the age profile. I think the peak, the last number that I have in my head is around 35 years. After that, very few formal jobs available for older workers. So in a way, yes, we may work longer. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to save much more, and because of that labor market. So that's one question there. And let me put another one, like, how do you think sovereign pension funds like Norway, Singapore could work compared to, let's say, more the system that we have in Latin America with AFPs, individual account system? Is there a place that we want to go?
You're a tough questioner. Those are both very big questions. Let me speak first about the second one. So there are some countries, and I would think of, again, Singapore, since I've done a lot of work there. In Singapore, they have basically a 40% tax rate on salaries. And it doesn't all go to retirement. It's divided between retirement, health insurance, other saving, child's education. And it does actually vary by age. But the point is, it's a national provident fund. It's mandatory. And the government is very good at collecting taxes and make sure the money goes into the pots. Then for the retirement piece, the money is in the main managed by the Singaporean government. And it's a black box. Nobody really knows where the money goes. And there's been a pretty steady rate of return managed through the government. If you wish, in Singapore, you can take some of your money out and invest it in the capital market. And there's a list of accepted brokers and banks and mutual funds that you're permitted to invest in. However, the expenses of the investment in the private sector are very high. And so for most people, it makes a lot more sense just to leave the money with the government and figure they're doing as well as they can. So that's a system that's low cost, it's not transparent, and it's mandatory. And in a country like Singapore, where there's very good IT infrastructure and people know each other's business, it's easy to keep track. Norway is a little bit of a different case because that's a sovereign wealth fund. It's not really a pension fund, and we can talk about those separately. But the other side of the coin that you were talking about is that in many Latin American countries, formal jobs are few and far between, that maybe at some point they're hard to get, especially in this economy, they're going to be extra hard to get. I always go back to the labor market. If the labor market is not functioning well, if people are not coming into the labor market with the jobs and the skill and the education they need for a 21st century economy, then we have to go look at the source of the problem. But depending on the country, there may be other issues as well. Of course, in some countries, in India is probably the most notorious, it's virtually impossible to set up a new business and get a lawsuit settled. It can take lifetimes to settle a lawsuit. Well, that's not conducive to a well-functioning economy where people want to start firms and are able to get things going. So a lot of it depends on the legal infrastructure of the country as well. I remember when I grew up in Latin America, and one of the countries I lived in was Colombia, and this was a long time ago. So before cell phones. And the story was that if you wanted to get a telephone run to your home, a wire, just so you could call on the phone, it took 20 years. And the telephone book, for those of you that are old enough to remember those, they said was a list of people who had deceased, who had died, because it takes so long to get a telephone. So one of the wonderful developments with modern technology is the advent of cell phones, which is making commerce much more easy and attractive, information more available. And that's the kind of support and innovation that governments need to provide to the private sector so that can generate jobs.
Yeah, I think many speakers during this course, we all go back to the labor market. If the labor market doesn't work, there's not much no pension system will work without a labor market that functions properly. Let me go back to something that you mentioned in the previous answer, which is the possibility of withdrawing pension funds before retirement age. And this has been a really hot topic in the region lately, obviously with COVID. Even before COVID, some countries like Peru are allowing lump sum retirements of pension funds at retirement age. But now with the current situation, some countries are allowing before retirement age, and this is the case of Chile, obviously. So what is your opinion on using pension funds before retirement age? Is there something that we should be worried about, and what are your recommendations there?
I'm very unhappy at the development where people have been allowed to take money out of their retirement accounts. The US has permitted it, Australia, many of the Latin countries that you mentioned. I think part of the problem, again, is education, that people feel rich when they have a lump sum, and they don't realize how much money it actually takes to provide income in retirement. So people might say, oh, I have $100,000, I'm rich. Well, that won't buy you a very big retirement income. And so there's this, I would call it irrationality or lack of understanding about the retirement needs they face. But of course, once they take the money, then they're going to be subject to longevity risk. They're going to spend the money and they won't have a decent retirement to live with. So I think it's been a very bad precedent. I know many countries have been pushed along the way to allow lump sum payouts in the event of hardship. This was pre-COVID. In the event of my daughter's getting married and I need some money to pay for the wedding, in the event of sickness, etc. And many countries have until this point held the line on this possibility. But now with COVID, we see the pressures were too great to withstand. And I'm worried that at least in Chile now, there's an effort to have a second round of lump sums. And other countries, people have already used up all their assets. I believe the same will start to happen in the US because there was a stimulus bill which helped people through the initial part of the COVID pandemic. But unless Congress can get another stimulus bill through, that's going to be one of the only sources of income that people have. So I'm sympathetic to the problem, but I think there would have been a better approach. I think that as in many European countries, the government provided work subsidies, wage subsidies, so that employees wouldn't have to leave their firms, and so that the companies could retain the human capital, the skilled workers that they knew and trusted and worked for them. And so I think that would have been a better expenditure of funds that would prop up the labor market a little bit longer, rather than letting people destroy their own retirement.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. I think, those are complicated issues, and the response of countries have been, trying to compensate for many things that are happening. Let me go back to one of the questions that you mentioned in your presentation, and I think it worries me a lot, and I wanted to pick your brain on that. So you mentioned this problem of low interest rates in the future, which affects both the accumulation of savings and the price of the accumulation product, the annuity. Right. So do you have any thoughts on how countries are, if they're dealing with that issue, or they're thinking about how to deal with that issue, and what could it be done, and if it has any implications for the way we should thinking about these hybrid systems of financing intergenerational versus more saving for the future. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that low interest rates are here for the foreseeable future. There was an interesting study, NBER study, that looked at the impact of pandemics in the past, historic pandemics, on the capital market. And based on several pandemics, the authors predicted that there would be low market returns for the next 40 years. So this is not just a transient phase. It's potentially something that we could be living with for a while. So what's going to happen with low interest rates? Well, in fact, in Europe, they're already negative interest rates. And in the US, they're still positive in in nominal terms, but not in real terms. Like after you subtract inflation, they're negative. So what it means is, number one, it's a tax on retirees. Older people that had hoped to live on their savings now find that there's no growth happening in their savings. What it's doing to younger people is, if they understand what's going on, they will ideally start saving more. The problem is that there's not as good a reward for doing so. So when you think about what are the options, I think one clear option is to work longer, because potentially you can reduce the period that you need to draw down your savings for, and you extend the period that you're contributing into your accounts and not needing to draw down your pension. So those are two options. It's also the case that if interest rates are very low for a long time, people will be less likely to save in a tax-protected pension, because the value of saving in a tax-qualified pension is lower. So if they save, they're going to save outside their pension. So there's some asset reallocation that's likely to go on. In terms of, will the hybrid systems make it better? I don't think so. I mean, hybrid systems have typically a component of defined benefit and a component of defined contribution, but the economic reality is still there, right? Whatever components you have, if you're not making a lot of investment returns, it's going to be hard to pay for a long retirement. So I think that this next 3 or 4 decades is going to be an era where people simply won't be able to retire. And disability aside, which I'm very aware of, more and more people can continue to work. And we should just educate them that they're going to need to do it for their own good and for the good of the world.
Mariana, estás en silencio.
Yeah. I realize. There's so many interesting questions that are coming in, but we're running out of time. Let me finish with one question that I think it's important for the region. Given everything that we have talked, on the labor markets and the level of informality, the low asset returns, do you consider that for the region, for Latin America and the Caribbean, like non-contributory pillars or semi-universal non-contributory pillars are the solution for the incoming crisis? Or how do you see the next couple of decades for Latin America, where we have lived with very informal labor markets, and what kind of instruments we could apply for the next 2 decades, if you want?
Well, education first, and that's an absolute first step. By non-contributory pillars, Mariano, I think you're meaning pay-as-you-go systems?
Yeah, some pay-as-you-go system with like benefits that are not linked to your employment history, yep. which is many countries have already implemented in the region.
Of course. So I will tell you that about 6 years ago, I served on the Chilean Pension Reform Commission, and we had 24 members of this commission, which is a very large number of any commission. And we basically broke right down the middle. The economists on the council, on the commission, including Nick Barr, among others, suggested that the best step forward in Chile was to, number one, increase the contribution rate for people in the system because it was too low. And number two, to enhance the solidarity pillar for people who were poor, where the means testing had determined that really they had no assets, they had very little income. So that was, in short, what the economists suggested. The other half of the group, who were primarily non-economists, suggested that sooner or later the money should just be spent, that is to get rid of the $68 billion or however much it was at that point in the Chilean system, give it away today, and move to a sistema de reparto, a pay-as-you-go system. And our response was very simple, that Chile is a rapidly aging population. In fact, it's one of the most rapidly aging countries in Latin America, but all of them are rapidly aging. And if you are imagining providing around the same benefits today, in the future, that the tax rate on the workforce, the shrinking workforce, is going to be onerous. It's going to be extremely burdensome. There are going to be huge negative impacts on labor market behavior. And so that was our position, that moving to a pay-as-you-go system could have made sense 50 years ago, but not today, not looking ahead at the demographics that are presented.
Thanks. Yeah, that's something that all countries in the region are facing these days. Yeah. The tough choices in terms of when you think about pension reform, and they're looking at very complicated demographics. I mean, you know the numbers, but for the audience, so Latin America is the region that is aging faster, and probably in the next 2-3 decades, our labor markets and our countries are going to look very different.
Absolutely.
And that's a challenge that we have to face. Let me go to one question that that it's popping up all the time, and I think is related to what you just said. I mean, countries that are looking now to reform the pension systems now, and they have many imbalances, and you know, some of them have like large fiscal deficits. Some of them are facing with declining pensions in individual account system. Is there any, I don't know whether advice, but is there any principles that you would put forward when we think about the next wave of reforms that are going to be implemented or at least discussed in the region?
Well, as I said at the beginning, every retirement system is a unhappy or a tense balance between welfare, that is redistribution, and insurance, that is paying people more that paid in more. And the balance, I think, changes over time. The reality, however, is that the social security systems that got started over the last 50 years, all of them were relying on a rising fertility rate, a growing workforce, and the ability to tax to pay rising number of retirees. And we're in a new world now. That's simply not feasible. So the best I think we can try to do is establish, you know, a minimum benefit, which is enough to cover subsistence. And beyond that, retirement systems probably won't be able to pay much. And so then it's the other pillars of the other legs of the three-legged stool that need to grow stronger.
Okay. Thank you so much, Olivia. It's been a wonderful session. Thanks so much for your time and answering our questions and being part of this course. We look forward to your new initiative, and really, please do share with us, and we'll also be sharing with our members in the pension network. I think it's great that we keep pushing the research in this area, because as we say in the IDB, I think this is going to be the most important public policy in the decades to come, with huge implications, fiscal implications, but also economic for our labor markets as well. So thanks, Olivia, and thanks everyone for being here with us this morning. So we finish this session here. Next session will start in approximately 1 hour at 11 o'clock Washington time. We will be talking, I will be part of this panel, as you can see. We'll be talking with what are the position of multilateral institutions in this debate. So we're very happy to have very good representations from the World Bank, the ILO, the OECD, the IMF, and obviously the IDB. And we'll be discussing, what is the role that we can play and how we can help countries navigate these very complicated times. Thanks so much, Olivia. I look forward to seeing you in person.
Muchas gracias. Muy amable. A todos.
A todos.